And, our theme for the book of Matthew is when God broke his silence, and then we have kind of a tagline at the end of it. And this one is this: he shows us how to live missional in a corrupt kingdom. Now, missional is a term that is kind of more of a modern term, but what it says is this, is all of us are missionaries, hence your missionary commission service with communion. We are to live as missionaries in the world that we live in. And what that means is this: we come and we get to know people, but we look at people through the lens of being missionaries. That the people that God brings in our path isn't just happenstance or coincidence. It's ordained by God, who has connected us with people so that we could share our lives and the gospel with them. And so, again, that's the kind of the hot term that is being used. Books are written about it. But what does that really mean? What does that look like for us? What does it look like for you and I to live as missionaries in our world today? That's the million-dollar question. First, what we need to understand is we need to see ourselves as missionaries. That we're not just passive people just going through life without a gospel responsibility for the people that God brings in our path. We have to have an understanding of who God is and what God has called us to do, regardless of where we live. Danny Lehman said this, I read this 30 years ago. He said, "A missionary isn't one who crosses the sea, but rather one who sees the cross." So when I'm talking about being a missionary, that's what I'm saying, is we're those who see the cross and see people through the cross as Christ has seen them, and then act accordingly. Why is this so important? Well, it's so important because the depth of sin in our world requires divine action. Nobody's going to argue that sin is running rampant in our world today. Nobody's going to argue that. Where I think people struggle is realizing that just as rampant as sin is, God's divine work is still happening. God's still working. As hopeless as it may seem to us, in God's eyes, it's not hopeless, because he's the God of all hope. And I believe this, that one of the biggest problems we are facing today is that some people have forgotten the cross, while others have forgotten why the cross was necessary. And what I mean by forgetting the cross, I mean we've forgotten that the cross is the focal point on how we deal with sin. Or not how we deal with sin, but how God dealt with sin. But then we forget, as time goes on, that we are in need of that cross as well in our lives every day. See, many have forgotten what the cross meant to them, while others don't think they need the cross. And so we must have a proper perspective of the cross, meaning this: we need to remember our need and our dependency upon the cross. And we need to remember that the cross of Jesus Christ has the power to change people's lives. Just let that sink in for a moment. It's funny because when we moved into this building 14 years ago, we put up a small cross. It's just a small one. And it's funny because as the years have gone by, I can walk through those doors and not even recognize it. It blends in. It has just kind of somehow lost its awe and wonder. And we need to be careful if that's what the cross of Christ has happened to us, if it's lost its awe and wonder. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 1:8, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." The cross is the power of God. So today, we will examine what it looks like to live as missionaries in a corrupt kingdom, remembering the cross, remembering what Jesus did, so that we can then go and do what God has asked us to do. And the first thing that we need to do as missionaries is we need to identify the problem. And that's what we're going to see in verses 1-5 of chapter 14. And so it says this: "At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. So we're introduced to Herod right off the bat. Herod. Now, Herod can be kind of confusing when you're reading the Bible because there's so many guys named Herod in the Bible. Have you ever noticed that? Here's why. Herod is a family name. It's not their first name like I'm Sean, that's Robbie, that's Robert, there's Eric. No, it's none of that. This is the family name. And there are many of them that exist in the New Testament, making it easy for us to get confused. So let's go back. Matthew 2:16 through 18, we're introduced to Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the guy who, when he heard that Jesus was going to be born, decided, let's kill all the babies. That was Herod the Great. Okay, we're not starting off so well, are we? Then, here we have Herod Antipas. He was a younger son of Herod the Great. He actually wasn't a king, but he was a tetrarch, which meant this. He was a ruler over a fourth of the kingdom. He wasn't even a king, but he sure had a kingly complex, as we see. Herod Agrippa, we come to him later on in Acts chapter 12. He's the guy that slew James and imprisoned Peter. He was the grandson of Herod the Great. And then you have Herod Agrippa II. He was the Herod whom Paul stood before in Acts 25 when he was on trial. And he was a great-grandson of Herod the Great. Okay, are you tracking? There's a lot of Herods. That's all I'm saying. And none of them seem to have a good track record. There's something about them. So what was the problem that they had? What are we going to see here? Well, the first thing that we need to know about these is all of the Herods were Edomites and they hated the Jews. So just by the fact of what they were born into, they hated the Jews because of that. They were treacherous rulers who really typified the God of the age, and they embraced the spirit of the Antichrist. I'm not saying they were the Antichrist, but they embraced his spirit. Like Satan, all of them were liars and murderers, according to John 8:44. That's what we know about Satan. He's a liar and a murderer. Jesus' ministry, when it was complete, having proclaimed the coming of the King and faithfully preaching God's truth, John said that not Jesus' ministry, when it was John's ministry, when it was complete, he proclaimed that of the coming King, he preached faithfully God's truth. He said that Christ must increase and I must decrease. That John the Baptist, was the guy here that Herod throws in jail because he wants to kill him, but he can't. Which really kind of then shows us the root of the problem. Because we're told here now that Herod couldn't put him to death. Why? Because he feared the multitude. He feared the multitude. Why? Because when you care more about pleasure and politics, you then need to please people to get what you want. So people now become the means to an end. It's a good thing we don't have this problem anymore. You guys are laughing. But you know what? Really what we need to do is we need to identify the truth. The truth of how do we learn to be missionaries in this time of corruption where people are no longer people. They've lost their dignity, value, and worth. And all the people that are supposed to be protecting us care about is themselves. How do we live as missionaries in this time? It goes back to never forgetting the cross. And never forgetting that the cross is what can change the world. Not a ruler, not a president, not a king, but Jesus. The cross still has the power to change lives. Only King Jesus can change what's going on in the world today. And he uses missionaries like you and I to do it. So having identified the problem, the next thing that we need to do is we need to understand that there is going to be corruption. Makes sense. That's what verses 6 through 12 was all about. It says, but when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore, now talk about, right there off the bat, it's already corrupt. Right? I mean, talk about a horrible experience here. It says, therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So she, having been promised by her mother, said, prompted by her mother, said, give me John the Baptist's head on a platter. Let it sit in for a second while I take a drink of water. Who asks for that? Nobody in their right mind. And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oath and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. And so he sent and had John beheaded in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then the disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. Just think about that for a moment. Does that grieve you? Does that not make you sick? Does that not make you appalled? Good. Because it should. Because that's how we should look at sin. Because this is a result of sin. And the world's going to be corrupt. It's going to be ugly. We shouldn't expect it to look anything different. We shouldn't expect it to come across a different way. What we have here in verses 6 through 12 really are a flashback showing us of the king's corruption. It's not like these things happen and then we'll get to the next part where Jesus feeds the 5,000. No, this is kind of a flashback looking back. And what do we see? We see Herodias, who was now, Herod's wife, kind of going crazy. Why? Because we were told that John told Herod, you probably shouldn't be with her. Why would he tell her that? Here's why. That was Herod's brother's wife. Herod thought, whoa, she's hot. I love it when my girls say, oh, he's hot. And I say, well, don't forget, so is hell. So Herod thought she was hot. He got rid of his own wife and stole her from his brother. That's not corrupt, is it? It's crazy. John then confronts him saying, you're in a position of authority. Probably shouldn't do that. Herod didn't like that. So what's he do? He takes JB, throws him into prison. Can't kill him because he's afraid of the people. We already saw that. Mark tells us that while John was in prison, that Herod came and talked to him. They began to form a friendship and had this relationship. That's why he was grieved and why he didn't want to do this. And Herod somehow saw him as a just and godly and wise man. Maybe he was even a little convicted of his sin. My point is this. We should not be surprised by the corruption in this world. The world has always been corrupt. It's not like in 2024 we're talking about, oh no, I didn't expect that to happen. We've never seen corruption before. This is pretty bad, don't you think? Everything about it is bad. Yet, like John, we need to speak truth into people's lives. But like John, it needs to be into their lives, not just at people's lives. We're really good at speaking truth at people, but as missionaries, what we need to do is get to know people so that we can speak truth into people's lives. It's a huge difference. So how do we do that? We get to know him. We get to know him. But you also need to know this. As you get to know people, as you begin to speak truth, as corruption is a reality in the world that we live in, it's going to lead to persecution. Now, when I say persecution, I'm not saying that you're just going to be called a name. That could you imagine Peter, who was killed, crucified upside down, hearing about the persecution that well, they don't like me. They don't like my Christian t-shirt. They don't want to be my friend anymore. Hey, they didn't like me either. You know what they did? They killed me. Persecution is a reality. When Jesus, when he was speaking about his death, he said this in John 16:33. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace, and in the world you will have tribulation. There's going to be trials in this world. But notice what he says this, be of good cheer. He says, hey, you're going to be persecuted, there's going to be tribulations, but embrace it with a smile on your face. And what does he say? I have overcome the world. Jesus has, past tense, overcome the world. Come on, well, that should have been a bigger amen. That's not just an Aldana amen. That's like everybody amen. That's like almost Pentecostal amen, but with a seatbelt. So that's what. Corruption and persecution will be a reality, but we must remember that so is the cross. And that on the cross, Jesus overcame the world as he loved the world. What did Jesus do? He left heaven, came to earth. It sounds like a missionary to me. Spent time with the world, the people in the world that he created in his image. Heard their stories, touched their lives, spoke into their lives, not just at their lives. He was moved with compassion. He loved them. He loved the world. You see, the cross helps us to see people who once seemed to be our enemies and once seemed to be enemies of God, and it helps us to see them how God sees them, as people who are worth dying for, people he has compassion on, people like you and me. People worth sending a missionary to. Missionaries like you and me. So now the question becomes, how do we live as missionaries in a corrupt world with persecution? How do we do that? And that's what verses 13 through 21 are, as we identify and as we embrace a lifestyle of compassion like Jesus had. And this is one of my most favorite passages in the Bible, probably because it has to do with food. This is why I believe Jesus was Portuguese, even though I know he was Jewish. But he shows up and there's never going to run out of food. I mean, I'm telling you, if you're Portuguese and you run out of food, it's a disgrace. True story. Connie and I got married 30 years ago. Didn't have a dinner at our wedding. My grandmother did not talk to me for 3 years. 3 years. She raised me for 10 years. But because I disgraced the family name and didn't have a dinner at my wedding, she's not going to talk to me for 3 years. She's still salty about it 30 years later. Do you remember you didn't have food at your wedding? Yeah, because you wouldn't pay for it. That's what I told her. That's how I get her back. Anyway, sorry. I'm hungry. We're talking about food. Verse 13, when Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitude heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, and he healed their sick. And so, having heard what took place, having heard the fact that his friend, his cousin, John the Baptist, was murdered, what does he do? he goes away and he departed to a deserted place. Not a desert place, a desert place. Okay? He went to a deserted place. And you know what? Sometimes we just need to get away and be alone with Jesus. Number one, you want to know how you're going to overcome the discouragement of this world? Take time to get alone with Jesus. I'm going to give you permission today to take out your phones and don't just put the silent button down. Hit the side button and turn the thing off. Turn it off. Amen. You see, sometimes you just need to get alone with Jesus. Here's the other thing. I'm going to give you permission not to turn on the news. You know, you don't have to. You don't have to turn on the news. It's just a bunch of noise anyway. It's just a bunch of noise. Here's what I'm finding. That the more connected we are to the news, the more fear and anxiety we seem to have. We're anxious. For the last year, here's how I've been getting my news. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I read this thing called The Pour Over. And it takes 5 minutes to read it. And that's all the news that I need. Because I get the world news, I understand what's going on, then I get a biblical perspective of how to view what's going on, and I'll tell you what, it's amazing. Now, at first I wondered, well, am I getting this news accurately? And for the last year, I can tell you this, it's been right on. And you know what I haven't been? Anxious. You know what I haven't been? Caught up in all the fear. We moved my mom in December, and she likes to have the news on 24/7. And so sometimes I have to sit close to her room so that if she needs something, I can hear her. And I sit there and I hear this news, and I'm like, oh my goodness, there's no wonder everybody's freaking out. Just the stuff that's going on. Now, this is for national news, obviously. So local news, it's a little different story. You know, we look at the, what's going on in the, local stuff, and we kind of pay attention to that. But man, 15 minutes a week, it's enough to stay informed while being encouraged to take a biblical approach to what's happening in the world. I would encourage you, subscribe to it. It's free. I love it. But here, Jesus finds himself face to face, having gone away with the same multitude that Herod saw himself face to face with. But their response is totally different. Jesus doesn't fear them. He was moved with compassion for them. How did he get there? He got away to be with the Father. He disconnected. He got away. He said, God, this is horrible what's going on. What do I do? How do I live today? He was moved with compassion, we're told. That phrase means this. It means to be moved to the depths of your being. So not only did he have compassion for them, his whole being was compassionate over them. And we're going to see how that plays itself out. How could Jesus be this way? Well, he spent more time talking with people than listening to the news about them. Try that one. Talk to them. He rejoiced with them. He listened to their stories. He felt their heartaches. Did you know this? That if you take 10 seconds and find out somebody's name and use it the next time you see them, when you have a conversation with them, that it'll impact their lives greatly and it'll put a smile on their face just by using their name. Try it. Use the name, and this is an easy one, that's on the badge at the grocery store of the lady who checks you out or the guy who checks you out. Call them by name and ask them, hey, Stacy or Lucy or, Sophia, whatever their name is, how's your day going? And watch how just the fact of using their name impacts their life. His action was completely different than Herod, who had John killed. Jesus, we're told, healed their sick. But he didn't stop there. Look what he did in verse 15. And it was evening. His disciples came to him saying, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitude away, that they may go into the village and buy themselves food." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." The disciples are your typical group that forgot the cross. They looked at the people and they're like, "Whoa, wait a minute, we got a problem here." And it's not us, it's them. Jesus, they're the problem. And I'm so actually encouraged by their conversation between Jesus and his disciples. I mean, look, here's what happens. The disciples show up. "Jesus, man, we've been busy all day. It's getting late. We're in the middle of nowhere. We got to figure out where we're going to eat. Can you please tell everybody just to go home?" And then they justify it. Look how hungry they are. That's, again, why I think Jesus was Portuguese. They knew to get to him, they had to point out the hunger thing. Actually, if you ever eaten at a Middle Eastern house, holy cow, they're even more, centered around food than the Portuguese are. I think that's why I like Nazareth so much. Now I'm thinking of falafels. Anyway, sorry. That's what happens when you got ADHD. You never know. But so Jesus says this, "Guys, they don't need to go away. You feed them." This is going to reveal to us what compassion looks like. But not just compassion for the multitude, but also compassion for the disciples who didn't get it. Showing us that we need to rely on God's grace to do the things that he's asked us for. Could you imagine being the disciples at this point? What? What do you mean we feed them? How are we going to do that? Like, dude, you know our paycheck? You know how much we get paid. How are we? There's a lot of people. We're going to find out there's 5,000 of them. But that wasn't an impossibility for God. Look at verse 17. And they said to him, "We have only 5 loaves and 2 fish." He said, "Bring them here to me." Then he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitude. So what do the disciples say? Finishing the conversation, we only have. Sometimes God asks us to do something that we think is impossible, because what God is longing to do is the impossible. And these guys were so caught up with what they had, realizing that in what they had, it wasn't enough to do what God asks. And here's the thing. What we have is enough. That's what this passage tells us. We have what is enough to do what God has asked us to. They thought it was impossible. Why? Because they were only looking at their hands, not the one who was in their midst. When we look at what we have in our hands, it does look impossible. When we look at what's in our hands, we think, how in the world is this world going to change? Because I don't have the means necessary. When I was in Uganda the first time, I looked around and God showed me, you know what? You're never going to solve the poverty in this country. And my heart broke, and for 2 days I was wrestling with God. Well, then why did you bring me here? Only to show me what I couldn't do. And then as clear as the day, he said this. He goes, I didn't call you to change a nation. I called you to love the 29 people that I brought to you in 2020. When I looked at my hand, I saw the limitation. But when God clarified what he asked me to do, it was something different. And it's amazing because notice what Jesus says. He doesn't say, well, you're right, you don't have enough. No, he says, give me what you have. And so he takes what they have. We're told then that he makes the multitude sit down. Immediately my mind goes to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's what we have here. You see, Jesus sees our limitations as opportunities to display his compassion. We think we're limited. God says, no, you're right where I need you. That's all you need. And then Jesus takes what we have, blesses it, and then gives it back to us to distribute. He takes what we have, blesses it, and then gives it back. And you want to know what the results are of that? Verse 20. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. I love that. What we have is enough to impact the people that God brings our way. They didn't impact the entire world or the whole entire region. That day there was 5,000 men with women and children there. And that day God took what they had to meet those people's needs. You see, if we try to do the whole thing, we're going to get discouraged. But if we live day by day, moment by moment, saying, God, who are you bringing to me, and how do you want to use what I have to meet their needs? To show them that you love them, to show them your compassion, to show them your heart. Show me how that's going to be. Here's what I have. Take it, use it. Make sure when they leave knowing that you are a God that pursues them and that satisfies them. The interesting thing to me as I was considering this was that the only people that knew there was a problem were the disciples. The crowd had no idea. All the crowd saw was Jesus say, thanks for this food. Here you go. The disciples are the only one that knew there was a problem. Everybody else was filled. But if you play it out a little bit, there would have been two types of people that didn't eat this day. Those who the disciples chose not to offer food to, or those who rejected it. That's it. Everybody else would have been satisfied. Even the disciples ended up with more than they started with. So what does this mean for us? It means this: to live as missionaries today means we have to have compassion for people. The people that God brings to our lives. And we have compassion as we look at them through the lens of the cross. Maybe we do it another way. In our theology class, I think it was a couple weeks ago, we were talking about God's grace. God is grace. And maybe it was last week. I don't know. I'm too old. I don't remember. But God gave me this vision, and it was clear as day, that if we are going to see the people the way God sees them, we need to draw so close to the heart of God that we're looking at humanity through the hole in Jesus' side. And I had this picture clear as day. Because when our heads and our bodies and our lives are so close to Jesus' heart, not only are we hearing his heartbeat and feeling it beat, but then we're looking through that hole in his side at the world around us. And how could we not be moved with compassion? Because we remember how much compassion Jesus had for us. So as missionaries, let us identify the problem. World's corrupt. The world fears men, not God. It's that simple. Let's understand that the world's corrupt. Been that way for a long time. It's nothing new. And let us embrace compassion as we draw close to the heart of Jesus so that we could see people through the hole in his side. And taking it one day at a time, taking it and saying, okay, God, what are you doing? Turn off the news. Get away. Turn off your phone. Disconnect. Go camping. Eat a s'more. Meet with Jesus. Because when you do, you'll be ready to face whatever multitude God brings your way. See, we need to remember that ministry takes place when human needs are met with divine resources through loving channels to the glory of God, according to Warren Wiersbe. Ministry takes place when human needs are met with divine resources through loving channels to the glory of God. And then let us be those who trust Jesus with all that we have so that we can serve the people that Jesus brings into our lives. Guys, that's what we're commissioned to do today. Is to be missionaries and be compassionate to whoever Jesus brings your path today.